This is our last lecture video for the course. This is a review lecture. Though the information here should not be new to you because it draws from all the past lectures, it should nonetheless be helpful for you as you think about how to answer the final test's essay question on representationalism versus direct realism. First, a brief review of what we covered in the last lecture. There we delved into Kant's representationalist and transcendental theory of perception. Reminder again that transcendental for Kant means the a priori conditions that make experience possible. His theory of perception is transcendental because it transcends the merely empirical to include the non-empirical, or more accurately, pre-empirical level of the mind's functioning that allows us to register and make sense of our experiences. We saw that Kant argues that perception necessarily involves a synthesis of what he calls sensibility and understanding. This happens at an a priori level when the mind takes in sensory information from the world as necessarily being in space and time, and then applies that to the categories or pure concepts of the understanding. Kant thinks this is what gives us knowledge of what he calls appearances. So this means that all our mental images, both conscious and preconscious, are made possible by the imagination's a priori and a posteriori functions. The imagination on Kant's view then has two levels. One, productive, which is transcendental, and two, reproductive, which is empirical. Or, in other words, the productive level is a priori and the reproductive level is a posteriori. So those two levels include one, productive, which produces images by synthesizing intuitions with concepts to create a 4D representation. And then, through the reproductive function, reproduces images by associating impressions that are derived from experience. These two functions of the imagination combine first to create a 4D mental image, 4D meaning 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension, and then to hold the image in the mind for comparison and association with other images/experiences. Kant's theory of the imagination means that he understands perception as requiring mental representations. It also means that we do not engage directly with the objects themselves, but with their appearances, meaning the way they appear to us as a result of the work our brains do in taking up the data from the world. That mental work involves a combination of what Kant calls receptivity, meaning the taking up of sense impressions, and spontaneity, meaning the application of those impressions to the categories. Because of that process, one that has to be in place in order for us to have any experiences at all, it means that we only engage with objects as they are experienceable by us. And what does that mean? It means that because of that synthesizing work, our imaginations are doing to match up a priori functions with a posteriori experience, we take in information from the world as already having what Kantians call content. It means that the information is registered in its first instance as propositional. It means that our only way of experiencing the objects of sensation is in using those propositional clauses that we saw with Descartes. Our first experience of objects has a that clause, as in, it is the case that this apple is red. The fact that the information is taken in as conforming to a that clause is what makes it content-bearing. This means that the experience of the apple is already available to logic and thought. But Kant isn't claiming that the world itself is content-bearing. The that clause isn't in the objects. This is why he's very different than Berkeley, who also claims that the objects of the world are already available to thought in their first instance. The difference is that Berkeley claims that the objects are thoughts themselves, i.e., God's thoughts. But Kant is saying something totally different. Kant is saying that our brains are such that it has to register the information as thought through an a priori process that is already converting the information while it is being taken in. So that means that, on Kant's view, perception is not a matter of directly taking in raw sense data. It's rather that perception involves taking in mental representations that are based upon the objects themselves, without being exactly the same as those objects. They are immediately converted by the mind into objects of possible experience. That is, we take them in a way that is possible for us to experience them. That is why objects are appearances. They are for us how they must appear to be for us. And that's why Kant is a representationalist. It's because fundamentally Kant is arguing that the objects that we think about are representations in us that are derived from the objects of the world. He denies that we can ever know anything about the objects in a way that is not a representation, or in his words, an appearance. So that brings us to our course's main theme of representationalism. The remainder of this lecture acts as a course review, but one that specifically draws out the theme of representationalism versus direct realism that is present in every philosopher we've studied this term. The topic of this course was perception and imagination in 17th and 18th century philosophy, i.e., the early modern period. We saw that each philosopher we studied thinks of perception as unavoidably involving either the imagination or mental images or ideas. What they are all grappling with is the information that was coming out of the scientific revolution that proved that there is more to the universe than meets the eye, or ears, or touch for that matter. The scientists and philosophers of the period showed that our senses are interpreting information about the world. And that means that our senses are not actually directly telling us about the world as it really is. Our senses are doing interpretive work, such that things of the world appear to us in a way that is not necessarily an accurate reflection of what it genuinely is in itself. So, for example, what our eyes take in as the color green is not precisely speaking a reflection of greenness in the object. What our eyes take in as the color green is more accurately an interpretation of the way light is bouncing off the leaf's molecular structure. Chloroform absorbs every color of the spectrum except the one we know as green, which is bounced off the object, and that is what our eyes register. And so we experience a leaf as being green, even though green isn't literally in the leaf itself. On top of that scientific knowledge, Descartes, who was writing near the very beginning of the early modern period, gave philosophers a very strong argument for why we can't trust our senses, even if so much of our information about the world is derived from them. He writes, "Whatever I have up till now accepted as most true, I have acquired either from the senses or through the senses. But from time to time I have found that the senses deceive, and it is prudent never to trust completely those that have deceived us even once." One of his strongest proofs for this point is that our minds can't tell the difference between dreaming and sensing. This doesn't mean that we are always dreaming, but it does mean that the senses are not reliable if they can't tell the difference between a genuine encounter with an object and a fully imagined one. Here's what he says. As I think more carefully, I see plainly that there are never any sure signs by means of which being awake can be distinguished from being asleep. The result of both the scientific revolution and Descartes' arguments was that philosophers of the early modern period concluded that what we perceive of the world and what the world really is in itself are not identical. To say so, it was argued, is naive and vulgar. Vulgar as in the view held by people who are not scientists or philosophers, by people who lack education and are not thinking deeply about the scientific truths of the world. Instead, early modern philosophers understood perception as a result of a mental act that involves the imagination. Why the imagination? Because that is the faculty that is responsible for generating mental images or mental representations. The imagination is what generates ideas. And what science and philosophy were suggesting was that perception is fundamentally a matter of ideas. That ideas-based view of perception is called representationalism. It involves the mind generating a mental image that is based on what is experienced sensorially of the world. And so, what we are really and directly engaging with when we think about external objects is not truly the objects themselves. It is our mental representation that we are more properly engaging with. But this immediately raises an issue. The question becomes, how much do our mental representations match the objects? And is there any possible way to know if they don't match? Here's Descartes. And from the fact that I perceive by my senses a great variety of colors, sounds, smells, and tastes, as well as differences in heat, hardness, and the like, I am correct in inferring that the bodies which are the source of these various sensory perceptions possess differences corresponding to them, though perhaps not resembling them. Meaning that Descartes largely accepts that the senses are engaging with something outside of us and reflecting to us qualities that are specific to those things, but it is entirely possible that the mental image that our minds generate as a result of coming in contact with objects does not actually resemble the objects at all. It is quite possible that the reality of things is totally different. Perhaps objects are just a collection of quarks and atoms, of waves and reflections of light. One way that philosophers make this case is by noting how much our experience of objects is specific to our own minds and not to the objects themselves. Take fire, for example. We experience fire as causing pain, but you wouldn't say that pain is in the fire. Pain is the subjective way we experience the result of coming too close to fire. But if that applies to pain, shouldn't it also apply to other things too? Is heat really in the fire? It seems not. Heat is the way our senses register the emission of energy coming from the fire. And if that applies to heat, then what about the other things about the fire? Is brightness in the fire? That doesn't seem that different from heat. Heat is how our sense of touch or feeling registers the energy being emitted by the fire. Brightness is just how our eyes do it. So brightness must be in us too. And what about the rest of it? Things like burning or chemical reaction. Why not also say that those are in us? After all, these are just more ways that our senses are registering the chemical reaction that we are calling fire. It wasn't just Descartes who realized this problem with sensation. The empiricist philosophers like Locke recognized this issue as well. The difference between Locke and Descartes, though, is that Locke wants to maintain that all our knowledge is derived from sensation, meaning from experience. He's an empiricist and does think that our senses are the fundamental source for all our knowledge. What Locke determined was that our ideas are truly a reflection of the world as it actually is. It's just that they are only indirectly in contact with the world. Ideas, or mental representations, act as mediators between our thoughts and the objects themselves. Indirect realism holds that our senses are deriving information from the world. But it's just that the mind has to convert the information to ideas in order for us to think about them. And as a result, our perceptions are held to be realistic, at least at a certain level. But it's just that our access to that world is indirect. One of the problems with indirect realism, which we see in both Locke and Hume, is that it becomes difficult to maintain the realism part of indirect realism. Nailing down how much our representations are realistic reflections of the world becomes more difficult under scrutiny. But what these indirect realist accounts hold, which is common to all forms of representationalism, is that our experience of the world is mediated by ideas. And those ideas are both generated and retained by the imagination. The imagination is not thought to invent basic sensory ideas, but to take them up in the mind as ideas that can then be combined, retained, and recalled after the direct sensory experience is over. Here's Hobbes explaining this. Imagination, therefore, is nothing but decaying sense, and is found in men and many other living creatures, as well sleeping and waking. So what was once direct sensation becomes ideas in the imagination, which we can recall with the aid of memory. Here's Hobbes again. Much memory, or memory of many things, is called experience. Again, imagination being only of those things which we have been formerly perceived by sense, either all at once or by parts at several times. We need to have this kind of mental holding of images in order to genuinely register the world perceptually. That means that instead of a view of perception that says that we only passively take in sense data, perception is understood as a more complex mental process that involves imagination and memory in order to convert and retain sense data as ideas that can be held in the mind as thoughts. Here's Locke explaining this view. Idea is the object of thinking, every man being conscious of himself that he thinks that there are, 'tis past doubt, that men have in their minds several ideas, such as are those expressed by the words whiteness, hardness, sweetness, thinking, motion, man, elephant, and so on. And so for this reason, sensations should be more properly understood as ideas, because, as Locke sees it, the physical response to sensory data alone is not enough to call something perception. For example, if a sound goes off while you sleep, and so you don't hear it, the ear itself is not off. The sensory organ is still operational for picking up sound vibrations, but you wouldn't call that hearing the sound. It's only a perceptual experience if you actually register that you've heard something. That means that perception of sensation has to be an idea, not just a physical reaction to stimuli. Here's Locke. First, our senses, conversant about particular sensible objects, do convey into the mind several distinct perceptions of things, according to those various ways wherein those objects do affect them. And thus we come by those ideas we have of yellow, white, heat, cold, soft, hard, bitter, sweet, and all those which we call sensible qualities. This great source of most of the ideas we have, depending wholly upon our senses, and derived by them to the understanding, I call sensation. And this is why Locke is a representationalist. On Locke's account, what the mind engages with in perception is not the things themselves, but the mental representations, i.e., ideas of them. However, Locke nonetheless did want to give us an account of the objects as they are in themselves. He is an empiricist, not an idealist. So he doesn't think that the world is composed only of our ideas of them. But distinguishing what it is about objects that is in us versus what is in the object proves to be very difficult to do. His primary secondary qualities distinction was supposed to do that. He was aiming to say that only secondary qualities like color, heat, sound, and so on are in us. He wanted to assign fundamental things about objects to the things themselves. These are the primary qualities of extension, substance, quantity, and so on. But Locke's view was much criticized for this. All the reasons Locke gives us for saying secondary qualities are not in the objects also logically apply to primary qualities. Locke himself seems to struggle to justify why he can tie primary qualities like extension and number to an object's substance, when he at the same time acknowledges that he doesn't think that we can have an experience of substance itself. Here's Berkeley criticizing this. Then, as for solidity, either you do not mean any sensible quality by that word, and so it is beside our inquiry, or if you do, it must be either hardness or resistance. But both the one and the other are plainly relative to our senses. And this gets at a major problem that all representationalist theories, at least of the early modern period, suffer from. Representationalism divorces the perceiver from the objects themselves. When you start saying that all we know of objects is our mental representations of them, you end up losing access to the objects themselves. It becomes very difficult to explain how we can know that our mental representations are like the objects they are presumed to be derived from. As a result, both George Berkeley and Thomas Reid tried to defend some form of direct realism as an appeal to a more common sense view of perception. The idea is that it's only philosophers who wonder whether our perceptions are like the objects of perception. The common sense view just takes it as given that our senses do what they are designed to do, to put us in touch with things. Here's Berkeley again. I assure you, Hylas, I do not pretend to frame any hypothesis at all. I am of a vulgar case, simple enough to believe my senses, and leave things as I find them. To be plain, it is my opinion that the real things are those very things I see and feel, and perceive by my senses. And here's Thomas Reid with a similar complaint. Descartes, Malebranche, and Locke have all used their talents and skill to prove the existence of a material world, and with very little success. Poor uneducated folk believe unquestioningly that there is a sun, moon, and stars, an earth that we inhabit, country, friends, and relations that we enjoy, land, houses, and furniture that we possess, but philosophers, pitying the credulity of the vulgar, resolve not to trust anything that isn't founded on reason. However, despite these efforts to return to some form of direct realist account that allows us to find certainty in the information coming to us from sensation, the philosophical motivation for representationalism hadn't gone anywhere. Neither Berkeley nor Reid give us a very persuasive explanation for how we can get around the fact that sensation is an interpretive mental activity. Berkeley proposes that there is no material substance, but he found few long-term philosophical followers for that view. Reid is more influential in the long run, but he doesn't himself actually reject the proposal that sensation is taken up by the mind as ideas. He doesn't really give us a reason to think that our senses alone give us certainty, nor how precisely his view surmounts the transition from object to perception of objects. Early modern philosophers thus kept representationalist theories of perception. Why? because there is overwhelming evidence that our senses are interpreting rather than directly presenting the world to us. The philosophical issue remains: how can our awareness of the world come from anything other than how our senses interpret the data? That means that we are always going to be once removed from the objects. Our senses take in information in a way peculiar to our needs. And so we take in sound, not as waves of particles, but as what our ears interpret as sound. We take in color not as light bending in certain ways as it hits objects, but as what our eyes take in as one color among a spectrum contained within light. And this means that the interpretation of the objects of the world is in us, and not in the objects themselves. And Hume shows us that there are even more aspects of our ideas about objects that don't even come from sensation. He shows that there are a lot of things that we assign to objects that are not actually possible to experience. Things like necessity, causality, and continued existence, i.e., identity. Sensation is dependent on experience, and so these things are not coming to us via experience at all. And yet, they're not coming to us by experience at all. And yet, for Hume, all knowledge is derived from sensation. And so he attributes our experience of these things not to sensation, nor to reason, but to imagination. For Hume, many of the fundamental aspects of how we think about objects is then derived from the imagination's work in combining ideas together as related to each other and as unfolding in succession. Here's Hume. I have already observed that time in the strict sense implies succession, and that when we apply its idea to any unchangeable object, 'tis only by a fiction of the imagination by which the unchangeable object is supposed to participate of the changes of the coexistent objects, and in particular that of our perceptions. Hume is an indirect realist and a representationalist. He argues that the direct object of our perception is our mental representation, and not strictly speaking the object itself. He writes, "These faculties, therefore, if they have any influence in the present case, must produce the opinion of a distinct, not of a continued existence, and in order to that, must present their impressions either as images and representations, or as these very distinct and external experiences." He concludes that it is the former, that the combined faculties of sensation, imagination, and reason take up impressions as images and representations that are a combination of sensory and imaginative ideas. However, despite his skepticism about reason and the senses, specifically about their ability to give us information about complex ideas that include movement, continued existence, and causality, Hume does think that there is a real world of objects that we engage with. He argues that we get access to the real world through our simple impressions, which are forceful and vivid because they are an immediate and direct contact with a real world of objects. Our simple ideas are copied from those impressions. So this is important to notice. Hume is a skeptic about our complex ideas, but he's not a skeptic about our simple ideas. These are the fundamental sensory ideas that we get from direct access to the world. This is why Hume is an indirect realist, despite his skepticism. When you see a bright flash of light or hear a loud sound, that, he thinks, is not an invention of the imagination. That's a real contact with something in the world. It's only our complex ideas that suffer from that distance from the world, where major parts of those complex ideas can't be attributed to sensory contact with objects. It may well be that the world itself is causally connected with objects that have continued existence. But Hume's point is that those complex ideas are impossible to causally connect to the objects themselves. He thinks that our mind is aware of those things through the imagination's work of assembling and connecting ideas in the creation of complex ideas. And in doing so, it adds concepts that are outside of our possible experience, things like necessity, causality, and identity, meaning continued existence. What we are in truth receiving from the world are a series of forceful and vivid impressions, which our mind takes up and interprets as mental representations, first as simple ideas, then as complex ones. Hume frequently emphasizes the force and vivacity of impressions as a way to maintain and reinforce his empiricist idea that there are real objects out there that we are actually engaging with, and that we are deriving, and from which we are deriving all our fundamental knowledge. But Hume, like Locke, also struggles to explain how and how much our representations are connected to the real world. His copy thesis is often criticized specifically because it doesn't make clear how exactly an impression can be distinguished from an idea. We saw in the Rickless article that many philosophers have tried to explain this distinction, only for there to be a bunch of counterexamples that show that it's very hard to explain what makes something an impression and something else an idea. He doesn't surmount the Cartesian dream problem. Everything he tells us about impressions seems to apply equally to dream imagery, as much as it does to sensation, meaning that dreams are also forceful and vivid and experienced as immediate. The main trouble with the copy thesis is that it distances us from the world of objects through that copying process. Then, when Hume seeks to explain the complex ideas that are derived from the copy principle's simple ideas, we get even further away, such that Hume himself tells us to just accept that there is much about the world that we just can't know, or at least can't justify as knowledge in a true philosophical way. Kant sought to alleviate Hume's doubt by solidifying the connection between ideas and objects. Kant didn't disagree with Hume's representationalism. He also thought objects have a double existence, as objects themselves on the one hand, and our perceptions of those objects on the other. To eliminate Hume's doubt about knowledge of things like necessity, identity, and causality, Kant instead rejected Hume's empiricism. By emphasizing the brain's processing a priori level, Kant argued that our thoughts necessarily reflect the truth about the objects of possible experience. But the caveat is that Kant must accept that our minds are incapable of touching the objects as they are in themselves, meaning that we are just not capable of knowing about how the object may or may not be outside of our possible experience of them. And this is why Kant calls the objects of perception appearances. And it is also why he is a representationalist, as I explained earlier at the beginning of this video. So that was a summary of how the philosophers we studied this term incorporated representationalism into their theories of perception. Most of our philosophers, with the exception of Berkeley and Reid, take for granted that direct realism is naive and obviously false. But in the last portion of this lecture, I want to give a brief defense of direct realism. There's going to be much that could be said. If you get the chance to study some 20th century philosophers like Ryle or David Dennett, you'll see much more of it. 21st century philosophers are starting to move away from direct realism, or at least many are. But in the 20th century, there was a real effort to rid philosophy of some of the cumbersome limits inherent in saying that we don't have direct access to the world. The following sticks just to the empiricist accounts of perception. But I should note as well that phenomenologists like Husserl and Sartre also rejected representationalism and idealism, though in a very different way. Nonetheless, their goal was essentially the same. They want to rid philosophy of the idea that the direct object of perception is mental representations and not the things themselves. So, as I noted, many 20th century philosophers came to reject representationalism. And so direct realism saw a big revival as philosophers aimed to philosophically explain how it is that our minds could have direct access to the world of objects. Why did these philosophers turn on representationalism? It's because they questioned whether a theory of perception that makes it impossible to know what things are really like can really be true. Is it really the case that our senses are not giving us direct access to the world? Should they really be understood as being just in us, as if our sensory responses to objects are not just a reaction to the objects themselves? Why can't the mind just directly engage with sense data? The early moderns took it for granted that everything in the mind is ideas, and that ideas are very different than physical sensation. And this meant that some kind of conversion process was happening between the objects and our experiences of them. But does that really have to be the case? Does sense data really have to be converted into ideas in order for us to be aware of it? Can't you just say that our senses are designed to put us in touch with the world, and that that in itself is a form of immediate access between our minds and the world of objects? So take, for example, the case of fire that Descartes first used and then we see again in most of the philosophers we studied who follow him, particularly Locke, but also Berkeley, Hume, and Kant, all make a nod of agreement to it. The idea is that it is obvious that pain is not in the fire, and that leads to a cascade of subsequent and analogous proofs. If pain isn't in fire, then heat isn't, then light isn't, and so on. But is that really true? Here's how a random chemistry website explains why fire is hot. I got this just by Googling "why is fire hot," just to get a generally accepted present-day scientific explanation. So thoughtco.com explains it like this. Fire is hot because thermal energy, heat, is released when chemical bonds are broken and formed during a combustion reaction. Combustion turns fuel and oxygen into carbon dioxide and water. Both light and heat are released as energy. So, is it truly accurate to say that pain and hot and light and so on are just in us and not in the fire? Why not instead say that pain and hot are the accurate ways that our senses let us know that energy is being released from the chemical combustion we know as fire? It's not as if our minds have to actively do a lot of work to make assessments like hot or bright. Isn't it more reasonable to say that we passively receive that information directly from the emissions of energy that is fire? Is there really a conversion happening? Or is it more accurate to just say that these are passive and automatic registration of the truth of what fire is? And how did we figure out that fire is a combustion reaction anyway? We applied our senses and our experience and our reason and so on. Is it really so complicated as our early moderns had it? Maybe it's entirely accurate to say that our senses just passively take in information about the world, and we then think about it without having to suggest that there is some kind of epistemological gap in the way. In other words, do our early moderns overcomplicate theories of perception? Maybe we just take in information perceptually. Our brains are designed to understand that perceptual data, and then we remember it and think about it. Why make it harder than that? Maybe our early moderns are also misunderstanding the mind's capacity to register sensory data. If the mind is more physical than our early moderns thought, then it wouldn't be so difficult to explain how we are able to immediately take up physical sensation as an object of thought. I've posted on Quercus an optional reading by Boyd Miller from 2017 called Thinking with Sensations. In it, he rejects representationalist theories of perception in favor of a more direct understanding of how sensation works. Students last year found that article a bit challenging, which is why I've assigned it as optional reading this year. But the long and the short of it is that Miller argues that we can literally think with sensations, meaning that we don't have to convert sensation to ideas. He thinks that the mind's ability to take up and engage with sensation doesn't require mental representations at all. We are able to just directly think about the world of sensation. Now, that was just a very short defense of direct realism. Doing the point justice would require a whole course of its own. But what I wanted to emphasize to you is that there are a lot of credible philosophical accounts of direct realism. In present-day philosophy of perception, the field is largely split between representationalists and direct realists, with several landing somewhere in between the most extreme ends of these views. Both sides have their baggage, to be honest. But what I wanted to do for you, what I want you to do for the final test is to think critically about representationalist views of our early modern philosophers. Were the early moderns right to dismiss direct realism? You might think that yes, even if representationalism complicates the picture of perception, it nonetheless can't be denied that our senses are doing interpretive work that requires the use of images and the imagination. Or maybe you think, no, all these theories of perception we've encountered are making a mistake by distancing us from the objects themselves. You might want to take up Jean-Paul Sartre's revolutionary cry to get back to the things themselves. But if you agree with our early moderns on their view of perception as being mediated by mental representations, which view do you think is most credible, and why? Ultimately, what I'm asking you to do in the final test's essay question is present an argument. Make a case for a position that falls under the theme of representationalism versus direct realism. The question is intentionally designed to give you a lot of leeway. I want to see you engage with the topic and think critically on your own. This is your chance to endorse the view of one philosopher if you wish. For example, if you think that Berkeley's idealism is better than Locke's indirect realism, you can build your answer around that. The only qualification is that you need to frame it around the theme of representationalism. So you would then perhaps make a case that Berkeley's account avoids the veil of ideas problem and simplifies perception by allowing us uninhibited direct access to things. Or you could go big by giving a more sweeping argument that demonstrates that the sum total of the theories we've learned here is that representationalism itself is wrong, and that naive realism isn't so naive after all. Or on the contrary, you could argue that the sum total is that, one way or another, our philosophers are collectively right, that each one gives us an excellent reason to reject direct realism, and as such, you could defend representationalism generally. The point is that I want an argumentative case from you. Decide what you think is most philosophically sound and defend your view. Make a compelling case to persuade your reader that your view is the right one. So that was our final lecture for this course. I hope that you enjoyed the collection of lectures and the theme of Perception and Imagination in Early Modern Philosophy. Feel free to send me an email with your feedback or questions for the exam. I'll be holding a final synchronous session on Thursday early evening at 6 p.m. Thank you everybody for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye for now.